we're here for free speech. We're here to fight back against YouTube. We're here to have conversations that we can't have. And one of those that we're going to have is with Thoughtbat. Now, I'll let Thoughtbat introduce himself here in just a second. So I don't want to put a political ideology on him. Obviously, there's a title with clickbait. I got you. Off. You know, I kind of presumed him to be an ANCOM, but he claims he's not an ANCOM. But so it'd be interesting to have a conversation with him. He is indeed a kind of a unicorn. When I say that, I mean, he is an anarchist and a leftist, and yet he's willing to engage with these conversations, willing to engage with the philosophy, willing to talk about the instantiation of property rights and all of those really nerdy things that cause most leftist anarchists to lose their shit, quoting out of context Kropotkin or something and just calling you a neo-feudalist. So I'm excited for this conversation. And I'm going to pull him in momentarily. But again, follow us on Twitch, follow us on YouTube. That's where you're going to see a majority of our content is going to be on Twitch live. And you can catch everything on Rumble afterwards. It might take a couple days because of Google's API to switch it over. Or we may have to manually upload it. And look out for a new channel page because it's the only way we can use emotes because reasons. So it should be fun. I'm going to go ahead and bring Thoughtbat on. Apologies for being 3 minutes late. Hello, Thoughtbat. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too bad. Yourself?
You know, I'm doing great. I'm going to cut your volume up just a little bit. I'm doing. Hey, don't do that. I'm doing great, man. I'm excited to have a conversation with you. If you haven't been turned off by Liquid Zulu, Liquid Zulu didn't scream at you, and you didn't scream at him, and there was no discussion, very limited discussion of rape, and that's a very good conversation with Zulu.
He's brought it up a few times with me before, but yeah, we try to keep it to the minimum with that guy. But no,
Yeah.
I created my channel as an attempt to try and calm things down between leftists and libertarians. We tend to have a lot of like pretty, what's the word? Bad faith conversation amongst leftists. Particularly on Twitter, and I'll admit that I'm not exactly the most well-behaved on Twitter. But when it comes to personal conversations like these today, I do believe in at least we should attempt to have a normal conversation, not like have a screaming match where you end up.
I've had a lot of bad experiences. I've been burned, and I've kind of learned my lesson to keep left-wing anarchists at arm's length. Just more as like a trust issue, because I've had situations, personal experiences, you know, people trying to spy, people trying to find ways to get you taken off the internet. You know what I mean? Like sending in people from their community to like screen capture things and selectively edit and then try and report you for those things. Like I've had a lot of things like that. And I used to be friends when I first started with a post-anarchist leftist and a community of people that were you know, I think the most right-wing people there were like the like Stirnerites, right? And there was only a couple of them. And they were kind of the bad sheep of that community before I showed up. And like that turned out horribly. You know, and then I look at the history and it's like I find it very difficult to make an argument for working with leftist anarchists from my perspective, right? From a historical perspective and my anecdotal experience. Because I mean, you look at Sade, he was murdered by the leftist anarchists. You know, you look at the Black International and like that was just kind of taken over, and Tucker, you know, was kind of like pushed and castigated aside. I don't know that that's like necessarily a betrayal so much as like the left just being dominant in the discussion and pushing him out because they don't want somebody that believes in like individualism, right? Or like, you know, and I don't even think I'm being shitty when I say that. Like, I think they would just push out individualists. And so, you know, you look at Hermos and like, you know, what the American anarcho-individualists were attempting to do. And then you have like these crazy German, you know, kind of like anti-cop wildcat people that are just causing violence with no real solutions or prescriptions. And it kind of ruined the American anarcho-individualist situation. So like when I look at this, I find it hard to, and I'm just being honest, like I'm not even trying to be like insightful here. I'm just trying to be, open. I find it hard to work with leftist anarchists because I mostly see them as evil. Like I mostly see them as the full instantiation of the philosophy that is promulgated in the left in statism. And it's like, and I see a lot of, and I almost feel more inclined to rally against them than many of my libertarian anarchist friends that are like, well, we should work with the commies on, on an anti-war rally, for example. I received a lot of pushback from LP people that were like, fuck you. And Clint Russell took me to task on his show about it because I was like, yeah, I don't support working with commies for anti-war shit because they poison the well and they poison the message. So I don't know, like hopefully you can. I don't know, maybe you can open me up a little bit to a better opinion in that regard. But well, I am very recalcitrant to do anything other than see someone that claims a leftist ideology as an enemy. Sorry, I'm being a little bit. I want to let you speak.
That's fair enough. I think the split in anarchism isn't just leftists and anarcho-capitalists. It's also within leftists as well.
For sure.
Because of course Benjamin Tucker identified quite strongly with the socialist movement. He was a member of the International. He wrote essays about why socialism is a good term to use for his ideology, despite being an individualist and then believing in markets. He wrote essay after essay claiming Kropotkin wasn't an anarchist, and this is way before Rothbard and the schism between left and so-called right anarchism.
Yeah, I mean, can we be fair though about Tucker? Tucker is kind of a special case in the sense that he was essentially dead and nobody knew who he was until Rothbard resurrected him again.
I'm not sure about nobody know. He did have that.
Well,
newspaper,
he was mentioned, but Liberty Magazine was lost, right?
It was lost, yeah. Okay, I'm happy accepting he was lost, but at the time Tucker was alive, he was quite influential. And then anarchism,
yes.
with the wave of what's it called, propaganda by the deed, anarchism became a dirty word in the US, whereas it was associated very strongly with the illegalist movement, and the assassinations of state leaders and all this sort of stuff that made states incredibly afraid of anarchists. And they basically did like a black McCarthyism. What I mean by that is what the US did to the communists during the Soviet Union times. They did it to the anarchists. It was the anarchists first who got the bad rap. And so really a lot of anarchists...
Well, I mean, to be fair, throwing dynamite at cops tends to do that. Like it does. I mean, not to say that that's the anarchist movement's fault or anything, but I think Hermos and kind of the German anarchists that came in were, I don't want to say they were particularly violent. I think there's a lot of propaganda that was laid on those anarchists that isn't necessarily true. And a few bad apples ruins it for the bunch on an ideology that Americans certainly weren't ready to be comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And that was recognized both by Tucker and even the anarcho-communist Enrico Malatesta. He was strongly opposed to propaganda by the deed for those exact reasons. Because he saw that it was making the anarchist movement look scary, edgy, not appealing to the average working class citizen. I think those criticisms of those kinds of actions, just random acts of violence, are fair enough. I don't believe in terrorism as a means of progressing any kind of libertarian movement.
So do you know the ANCAP answer to that question?
The ANCAP answer to that question would be respect property rights at all times. That's it.
No. I think if you talk to a lot more ANCAPs that actually understand the philosophy, what I think the answer that I would get from a lot of people in my server and a lot of people I've spoken to is actually that you have two sets of criminals that are both stopped from arguing for those rights. And so when my position is then one of tactics and one of moral preferences. But as far as what we would say is, if I see Antifa attacking cops, I see two groups of criminals attacking each other. It's not my position to say that they should be stopped or that there's a moral obligation or duty for us to intervene in any way, shape, or form. That's why I praised BLM when they were attacking the police precincts and utterly admonish them when they were like looting targets. It's like, yeah, attack the cops. Those are the agents of the state that are actually responsible for the shit you're mad about. Like, I don't like you as a tactic. I think you give a bad name to anti-fascism and a bad name to anarchism, but ultimately, like, I can't argue that force be used to stop them in that regard. And I would say the same during some of the workers' protests when you have the nation state, you know, doing things like, you know, intentionally putting mail on the railway cars, and then so that you can send the National Guard in to stop protests because workers feel like, you know, they're being exploited in some way. That's everybody's right to voluntary association, and the state stepped in to, on behalf of capital, if you will, if we want to use kind of like a more leftist term, right, to stop that. And I would say, even those dynamite instances, I would say I don't really have anything I can say about that unless we're talking about innocent, injured parties. But it's just bad tactics.
I think I do agree with that. I identify with anti-fascism, and I've been involved in anti-fascist action rallies, come into conflict with the EDL and all the rest of it. I was part of the Liverpool section where we held the fascists at Lime Street Station. We didn't let them leave. I haven't been involved in any proper scuffles at all, but thing is with Antifa, it's there's so many different branches of it, and some groups, some circles will have certain ideas about how they conduct themselves, and others will have radically different views. And the ones with the more violent ones will attract the worst attention. So you do end up with, like, well, because it's not one unified movement, you can't really.
Isn't that always the joke?
Can't really put a leash
right?
on them.
Isn't that always the joke? Like, you hear leftists and they'll say they're the CEO of Antifa, and they're like, Antifa's not a movement, like it's not an organization, but like they get political funding from left-wing neoliberals because they're mostly pushing a neoliberal agenda in their protests, right? Like, they're not fighting against the state; they're fighting against right-wing culture war issues in favor of the state and the corporations. I find most Antifa situations to be laughably anti-anarchist whilst claiming a black flag, when really they're just almost always just dumb teens.
Well, Antifa is not exclusive to the anarchist organization, don't forget. It's got a red and a black flag in there for a reason. It's because Antifa has a lot of Marxist, Trotskyist groups in there as well. So it's understandable that not everything coming from Antifa rallies is ever going to be purely anarchist. Antifa is itself a coalition between anarchists and Marxist-Leninists and all kinds of stripes. I've met Stalinists at Antifa protests. So, and I'm stood there as an individualist anarchist alongside someone who would quite happily murder me, which is an interesting experience. I'll tell you that. But
I don't consider ANCOMs and anarchists that like align so closely with communists to be anarchists. I don't understand. I don't consider most leftist anarchists to really be anarchists. I think it's an extremely rare find to find someone that self-identifies as an ANSOC or an ANSIN or an ANCOM that actually is an anarchist.
I think a lot of people will go under the anarcho-communist label, but I don't think they strictly adhere to the idea of communism per se. They always tend to really advocate something like syndicalism, mutualism, which is where I'm at, or collectivism at best. Normally, like voluntary associations of workers independently organizing their specific local workplaces, which has nothing to do with communism. Communism is a communal ownership. It means the whole society owns all the property within that region. And to have that property effectively managed, you're going to need some monopoly on law determination. And what's a monopoly on law determination? Well, it's a state. I've written a big thread on that.
As an ANCAP, I accept you as an anarchist, regardless of whether or not you're a mutualist, whatever label you take. I don't give a fuck about your label. Right? They're useful sometimes for categorizing what ideas, you know what I mean? Like when I hear anarcho-mutualist, I'm like, okay, you believe in personal property, you believe in a market economy, but you want a local market economy, and you don't necessarily believe in full private property rights. And when I hear an ANCOM, I think, honestly, I just think communist, and I think, classical Marxist is really all I think, because classical Marxism was designed to be that, but presumably they have a different strategy of getting there that makes them anarchist. I'll set that aside. I accept you as an anarchist, whatever governmental system you prefer, if you're actually against the state and the growth of state power. The problem that I have is so many on the left that call themselves anarchists say that any form of capital is state power, and that it's okay to further monopolize state power in exchange of regulation or control over corporations and capital. And to me, it's like, how do you call yourself an anarchist when you want to further monopolize state power? And it's over and over and over again with social issues, economic issues, wealth redistribution, etc. It's like, dude, if you want to donate money to Food Not Bombs and you want to set up a commune, like, hell yeah, brother, like, go be a socialist. Like, I'm all for it. You want a worker co-op? Hell yeah, brother. That sounds awesome. Like, I'm happy for you. Like, when you want to, like, increase taxes and, like, increase regulations on corporations, and then you're like, but see, there's no difference between capitalism and the state. It's like, yeah, there is. Like what?
Mm-hmm. You're touching on a very specific line of anarcho-communism,
Mm-hmm.
because Kropotkin actually wrote essays himself about why taxation is bad, and no one, anarchists shouldn't support it, even in favor of like taxing the landowners. Kropotkin was against that kind of approach. Kropotkin was very much in favor of direct action, in favor of establishing communism. But the strain you're touching on there is called weak anarchism, which is, we're not in favor of anarchism right here, right now. We don't want to act on our anarchist principles, but anarchism is a pipe dream for the future, and that's where they get the anarchist label from. Well, it'd be lovely if we could have all this voluntary association, these voluntary companies, these voluntary markets, whatnot, but we can't have that. We need to act strategically against capital. And
I see this.
Capital.
I see the only people that admit this openly, and maybe that's just because I'm an infiltrator as an ANCAP, right? At least that's the way I'm viewed. But I usually only see this admission come from the people that declare themselves libsocks, right? Like, do you feel as a leftist anarchist that there isn't enough gatekeeping within yourself of those individuals that are statist in their supposed alignment with anarchist principles from your perspective?
It's tricky when it comes to gatekeep, choosing when and when not to gatekeep. I think if you got a weak anarchist and they're saying, right, well, anarchism is an unachievable pipe dream for now, then they're not really allies of the movement. They're going to do what they can to support the state in any kind of movement towards this apparently unachievable idea. So if there's anyone's trying to take part in direct action, they're disrupting the system. They're making the left look bad, and maybe they're threatening to win to hand over the election to the right or whatever. They tend to end up being enemies of genuine, strong anarchists. Unfortunately, Chomsky's one of them.
Oh yeah, for sure. Chomsky's based sometimes, but I think Chomsky has lost too much favor by being too friendly to us and too friendly to the state. I think the final nail in the coffin for Chomsky was probably his position on the lockdowns.
Yeah, it's like it's what we all call the duct tape state, where we live in a broken system. We need to have this duct tape state running around, just patching duct tape on these incredibly leaky aspects of the economy. And they're just saying again.
Can I pose a hypothetical?
Go for it.
So let's say we're in a Discord server together. Let's say you manage a Discord server, right? Mm-hmm. And for communications about anarchism, right? Mm-hmm. And I come in, and on every position, I am an anarchist in your view, right? I work at a co-op. I engage in mutual aid and praxis. I call myself an anarchist. I'm well read on the theory. We're all the good stuff. And then we start talking about universal healthcare. And I say universal healthcare is a human right. Universal healthcare is, you know, like it's a positive right of people to that there are all these there's all this wealth in this nation. It's ridiculous that people are uninsured. And the government needs to get rid of the private insurance industry and create universal healthcare because it's a human right. How do you view me?
I view you as an inconsistent anarchist. I'd say if you're especially if you're a mutualist won't believe that. If you're claiming that you have the right to another's labor, then you're being anti-anarchist there. You probably
yes.
You
yes.
Get,
this is 95% of the leftist anarchists I jump into, right? What I just described to you. It's like I'm with you. I disagree with you, but how the fuck do you give the state power, right? Like you're literally consolidating power to the state away from the people because you think that he would consequentially do better by your analysis, and you're giving power to the government. Like you're not an anarchist.
I generally agree with that. They're like soft Marxists almost, because Marx believed in giving the government full power and waiting for that government to wither away. It seems that weak anarchists are kind of doing the same thing, but they want it to be done in a nicer way than totalitarian revolution.
Right.
I think it's a common mistake made by baby anarchists as well. Like if you're new to the movement, if you came into anarchism quite recently and you used to be just a run-of-the-mill socialist, then I can understand how you'd make that mistake, because you're not so clued up on the theory of mutualism or whatever, and you just sort of run back to your original default position on how we make sure everyone's got sufficient healthcare. I've actually got a good book about pre-NHS British healthcare and the role that healthcare co-ops, voluntary healthcare co-ops, looked after people.
Well, in America, we had. Did you look into the American healthcare system when doing your research?
I've only heard about healthcare co-ops as a third alternative to state and private healthcare, which is interesting. But I'm not too clued up on it.
So the early history of health insurance companies in America was the lodge system in America. What we did, and this is actually what caused the state to jump in, was because, you know, you have this massive class divide, you know, during the kind of the Gilded Age in America, right? You have the poor, you have a very limited middle class, and you have the wealthy elite. And doctors very clearly were in the wealthy elite. And so what ended up happening is the miners, it started mostly with miners, right? But large groups of workers decided that they needed healthcare, obviously, and that they couldn't afford healthcare. And so what they did is they set up a lodge system, which would be all of the miners would donate a progressive income. So like, you know, the foremen and the people that had more seniority that made a little bit more money donated a little bit more money than the new workers, right? You would all donate, kind of like union dues. And then what they would do is the lodge would hire a doctor, and then they would get like their yearly physicals, and like the doctor would essentially be on retainer to the lodge, right? Like when we need you in a mine collapse or something like that, you know, to like look up to the injuries, et cetera, et cetera. Whenever we need you, you know, you're on call, and here's your retainer. We pay you so that you can come check us out and do physicals and stuff. And what ended up happening is the people that were running the lodge started being like, yeah, you're a shitty doctor, and I have enough power now to negotiate your salary because 100 of us have come together to negotiate your salary. And the doctors really didn't like this. They really didn't like a bunch of poor, uneducated people telling them they're not good enough of a doctor, or having to be in a competitive market with other doctors and prove that they're good at their job. And it's very shortly after this that you see government regulations step in, and you see the formation of the American Medical Association to then start grabbing licenses and creating these pseudo private state kind of entities like the AMA, the ACA, the APA. These are all like private entities, but they're not really private because the state grants them a monopoly in like determining who has like an actual license and stuff. So it's like this weird, it's like exactly what the communists fear the most, like the merge of the corporate and the state. And that's when those systems started breaking apart and private insurance industry had to come in to deal with the massive amount of red tape that was put in. But it was a very similar situation in kind of the Gilded Age of America, where the workers were coming together and collectively bargaining for the services of doctors, and shit just went downhill from there. And it was actually way more effective and cheaper than our current medical system.
It seems a common trend where things are done voluntarily. And there's one section of people who wanted to use state power to secure privilege in the market. And then suddenly we've got people who want to address that privilege in the market with more privileges going the other way, rather than removing the original privilege.
Yes,
call me a tucker, but that's just how it seems to be.
So I didn't really know how this conversation was going to go, and so I didn't want it to just be like a slog fest into the theory like it was with Liquid Zulu. I mean, I feel like you've been beat over the head enough with embordering. And, you know, I mean, we can get into that, and I'm sure we will to a certain degree. But I guess this kind of steers us in that direction a little bit. But
yeah, because
I'm curious, what stops you from being an ANCAP? I'm always so curious when I meet mutualists that basically accept all of the same consequences of our axioms, but don't accept our axioms, and then add in this what feels like old economic layer to like avoid being an ANCAP. It's confusing to me. Like, why is it that you're not just an ANCAP?
It's an interesting question, but I did used to be a right-wing libertarian of the Chicago school variety, so Milton Friedman, that kind of era.
Friedmanite, yeah.
Friedmanites. I used to be of that, you know. I used to love the pencil analogy and the calculation problems and all the rest of it. Coordination problem, rather. And I was reading into David Friedman.
Well, you can love the calculation problem, too.
It's a good one. I can, because, you know, I'm still a Marxist anarchist, nonetheless. I was reading more about David Friedman, his son. I started looking into these rights enforcement agencies and the market that might produce those kinds of the kinds of laws that David Friedman would like to see, and how that would be a thing. The problem that I always had with right-wing libertarianism was we didn't have a demographic which was keenly interested in libertarianism. What we had was academics who liked being consistent and liked having these axioms, and they follow their political beliefs according to those axioms straight on. But then if you look at the business owners, the landlords, the petty bourgeois, whatnot, they put all their money into the Conservative Party. If you look at the workers, they put all their money into the Labour Party. They don't really go libertarian. And I'm thinking, well, who does a free market benefit the most? It kind of benefits no one, if you really think about it. It benefits no one in particular. There's no key base.
Benefits everyone.
There's no one clawing out for it. Which is why you don't get big donors going to the libertarian parties. They go to the Republican Party, so they're like having those state secure privileges. They'd lose a lot of their support. They'd lose those privileges, and they'd end up losing out to competition. So then that's one problem libertarianism has. I think any kind of anarchism has to have a kind of pro-worker, but it has to raise the standards of living for workers in some way or another. I don't necessarily think taking away all labour laws and then leaving it at that does enough.
So I'm confused, right? Because what we're talking about is a philosophy of rights, right? Where we derive our rights from and what rights do we have? And you seem to be very individualist in your philosophy. And egoists are just psychopaths, right? So I don't understand why anyone would proudly proclaim that they're psychos.
Okay, I'm an egoist. I don't think I'm a psychopath.
Why would you proudly proclaim that? Why would you proudly proclaim that you believe that might makes right and that no one has rights?
I don't think people objectively have rights. I don't think we derive them from the universe. When we talk about might making right, or when Stirner talks about it, he's talking about it descriptively. The context of those quotes come from the paragraphs that discuss where liberal rights come from. The bourgeoisie only got their rights through their own might. They didn't drive it for any kind of consistent philosophy, because there's contradictions all over the place. Talk about the French Revolution there. We recognize what is right through state violence. State violence indoctrinates us to believe what is right and what is wrong. And we can do the same thing.
Okay, but if you're only claiming, like literally every philosophy except for deontological religious philosophies and anarcho-capitalism claims that, and objectivism, right? Claims that rights are an objective fact. So calling yourself, I'm not that, isn't really calling yourself an egoist, right? Like if I hear the term egoist, I'm assuming you're choosing to associate yourself as a Stirnerite and presumably giving credence to the fact that if one person feels that they don't have what it is that they want, they have every means and should, in their own self-interest, just take, steal, rob, murder, if they can get away with it from others.
Mm-hmm. It's also,
you know what I mean? Like, it's weird to say, like, I'm not this, therefore I am this. It's like, if that's all you're saying, then why call yourself an egoist? Why associate with that?
The egoist aspect is that I do put myself and my self-interest above all else. Like everything I say, everything I believe in, everything I advocate circles all the way back around to me at the apex, my interest at the apex, and everyone is on the same kind of way. But in terms of, you mentioned if people thought it was in their self-interest to steal and rob and all the rest of it, they'll do it. That I suppose could be a little segue into a hypothetical I'm going to give you. I give it to Zulu. So if we derive rights objectively and they're absolute and they can't ever be neglected and all the rest of it, let's say hypothetically, as Ben Shapiro says.
Well, pause. We can. I would challenge the assertion that they can't be done because might doesn't make right, but might does make reality. I wouldn't say that. I would only say that one can't logically argue for rights themselves whilst they're stopped from arguing for those rights themselves, right? So I wouldn't say that, like, there's no right tree that grows rights that you can plant and then have more rights than others, right? I would only say that one can't logically justify their actions infringing upon other people's rights without, and at the same time argue that they themselves not have their rights infringed. That's so I would take a little bit of a twist. Like with Zulu and I disagree on a couple of things. So I wouldn't say that they're necessarily, I would say they are objective facts in the sense that it's impossible to argue against them legitimately, because I am an AE proponent. But nevertheless, it's a very small tangent, and I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to clarify that before you got too far.
That's fine. So you got you and your kid, hypothetical kid, are walking out in the wilderness, and unfortunately your kid gets stuck into quicksand and you can't reach him, otherwise you'll get stuck into quicksand and you'll both drown in the dirt. Luckily to your left there's a rope on the floor, but next to that rope is a sign saying, "This is the property of Mr. Jones, please don't touch it under any circumstances."
Right.
The egoist position on this would be to say, well, if your value for your son outweighs the value for respecting that property right, then you're going to do it. You're going to grab the rope and throw it to your son. The natural law position would just say that you can't grab that rope under any circumstances. You'll be a criminal, and you should be treated as one. You should pay reparations and whatnot, and that you should never. But not just that you should pay reparations if you do it, but that you shouldn't do it in the first place.
And so, this is where I differ with Liquid Zulu. Like when we say should, right? This implies a kind of a moral ought about what you should do, right? And I get a little bit, and I'll probably get flack from the objectivists and MRH Legacy if he's here. He's probably not because I'm on Rumble. Will like yell at me, and Liquid Zulu would yell at me. When I look at this situation, I don't see AE as giving. I see it as descriptive. I don't see it as prescriptive. So it doesn't tell you what you should do. It tells you, and they say, well, but it does tell you what you should not do. And therefore, because it tells you what you should not do, it tells you what you should do. But there's this whole domain of things that are justifiable. It's not justifiable for me to argue that it is right or morally neutral to steal someone's property to save my son's life, right? But the reality is, and all of these people, so many of these people will cope and lie. The reality is every single person in the fucking room, every single person put in that situation, unless they're a complete and utter psycho, is going to steal that fucking rope, right? And so this is where I separate moral condemnation from an understanding of the laws of the universe or the laws of logic and how they describe what one ought do, right? So I'm not going to tell you what you ought do in this situation. I can tell you that my moral intuition is I'm going to save my kid. And there's a means by which to save my kid. The problem is when you do not brand that person a criminal, when you do not say that that person is a criminal, they are objectively a criminal, right? They must pay restitution and retribution, which is whatever damage is done to the rope and whatever, court fees the person has to go through if they choose to prosecute, right? I got to pay all that. And I should pay all that, right? Because I am a criminal. Now, people can accidentally be criminals, right? People can accidentally trespass and not know that they're trespassing and they're on someone else's property. And that's why you have the gentleness principle. I see no reason why we do not apply the same philosophy of the gentleness principle. Why we look at it and say that's okay with trespassing, which is a property rights violation, but we don't do it in these like extreme hypotheticals. It makes no sense to me. The appropriate answer is I grab the fucking rope because I'm gonna save my fucking kid. And I recognize that I made myself a criminal by doing so. I've violated and aggressed upon other people by doing so. But I look at this from an objectivist perspective of I'm kind of forced between two anti-life positions. Anti-life position number one is I allow my child to die. Anti-life position number two is I present some moral positive to property rights violations and theft, which is an ultimate anti-life position as well when taken to its logical conclusion. So the correct answer is, as a parent, should you? I'm not going to tell you what you should or shouldn't do there. My moral intuition is, for myself, is I'll kill you to save my child, even if you've done no wrong, and I'll accept that as a criminal because that's my fucking child. It's my life. And I find it very interesting when these hypotheticals occur. The people that aren't honest about it usually don't have kids. I have children. You know what I mean? It's like, dude, I'll fucking murder you to save my child, and I'll go to prison happily. So, but it is important we recognize that it's a criminal act, that a person is choosing to be a criminal, and that I can't affirm or say that anyone else should do that logically. It's an illogical gobbledygook sentence of nonsense to say that one ought steal or aggress upon another to save something that they value. It doesn't. It's a nonsense statement. It's a performance. That's what
it seems to be thinking like the group of people you just called psychopaths there, because that's what the egoist position would be. The egoist position would be, well, regardless of what natural law may or may not say, regardless of its consistencies, when it comes to my action and how I treat property, I do not step back shyly from it. Now, you emphasize quite strongly there, it's my child that I'm saving. It's my child. Now, you wouldn't.
Well, it's not really my child, but I'm only using that because that's how the language is structured in English, right? Like it's not my property.
Yes, but it's your son, as in your fatherly relationship with your child.
Yeah.
It's
my
child.
Guardianship and my legacy, really, more so than it is my child.
Yeah, but it's still yours in a Stirnerite sense. Stirnerite property is not like the normal legal property. It's a very different concept. When people say, "Oh, Stirnerites are okay with people being property," he's referring to like my friends. My friends are my property because they're part of what is mine. It's my circle. You know, the ego on its own. I'm looking after my own. I'm looking after my friends, my brothers, blah blah blah. It's not something I have a legal right to control at all times. That's why it's a strange concept. When I box that.
There's a big distinction, right, between me and the Stirnerite, right? Like, which is that I recognize that it's a criminal act, and I do not say that one should do it. I'm just, when engaged in that hypothetical, I'm saying I know what I would personally choose. There's also this.
Exclusive there. It's not mutually exclusive. I think it's not mutually exclusive. There's a group of Stirnerites called the Illegalists. They know damn well what they're doing is illegal under either positivist or natural legal theories, but they still acknowledge that it's their interest and not necessarily the law, regardless of what it is, which drives their actions. That's egoism. It's your self-interest right there. Now, and I think that's a very reasonable position. When it comes to argumentation ethics, I want to just go through that with you because I think we pretty much agree on what we just said in our hypothetical. Can you just describe very simple, as if I'm a 5-year-old? Pretend I'm a 5-year-old. Just well, then I can't.
No, I can't. I cannot describe AE to a 5-year-old.
Well, look,
it's too complicated for that.
As a teacher, humor me. So, all right, give me your basic summation of argumentation ethics and what it means and why it's relevant.
Yeah, so I would say start with existence exists,
okay,
or a Christian ethos that recognizes that logic or logos is from God. Anything that gives you that, ultimately, I would go to existence exists, right? And I think it's important to ground logic, right, in that way. Other people ground it in like Christian ethos, for example. I'm fine with it because we reached the same conclusion. You know what I mean? But I think it's important to say we start with existence exists versus the supremacy of consciousness. And then grounding the law of identity, right? In that, this is, there are many blender bottles like this one, but this is the one. I can see it. It exists in material reality, right? From there, we can move into the other Aristotelian formal logic, right? So grounding the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. The important thing, what we're trying to do with AE is establish the law of non-contradiction, right? I think you've encountered AE enough to know what I'm talking about.
It seems that different people I talk to give different interpretations of AE. AE tends to change from context to context, person to person. Liquid Zulu will have it one way. That pseudominous person I've been interacting on Twitter will have it another way. And I'm interested to see where you take it.
Yeah, and the problem is that you have argumentation ethics in 1986, and then you have other people attempting to whittle it down and explain it. But then you have a development Hapa has a development in the establishing a historical link with property, in embordering versus homesteading, and getting rid of the unnecessary element of homesteading, which then changes the way that argumentation ethics describes the moves from the person, right, to the establishment of private property. So I think the problem is that there are multiple variations of argumentation ethics as Hapa has developed the theory that have changed it. And then also it's just a difficult concept. That would be my why maybe I think there's kind of different interpretations. So moving into those, I think the next place you have to go is you have to establish praxeology, right? In that understanding that human action is always the result of a rational actor and is always intentional action in the world, be it non-action or action, right? So even if it's positive, negative gen, there's still neutral gen, if you will, right? Which is to say not acting is still an intentional action because you're living and breathing in the universe. You're a rational actor, and you act in your own self-interest. And because you act in your own self-interest and with the available information that you have available, that isn't to say that that isn't to say, in a way, that isn't to say when you analyze that information later, you might not look at previous actions as irrational, but that's because you have additional information, right? What you're really seeing is an information failure of the market, like some knowledge missing of the consequences of your actions compared to your intended goals. But I would say that humans are rational actors that act in their own self-interest at any and all times. And then once we do that, we have to establish conflict, right? Which is the myriad of like Robin and Crusoe have a stick, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially conflict begins when two individuals wish to use a property or persons towards different means, right? I want to use a stick for fishing. You want to use a stick to build a raft, right? Both individuals want to use the same property for different means or in different ways. And when exclusive control of property is not established to include control of one's own body, bodily autonomy, right? Where we begin, that conflict has occurred. Once we get into those things, I would say the next step is Habermas's performative contradiction. And I think he explains it himself best by illustrating the examples of the postmodernists that make claims about truth being individual truths, that there is no objective truth, that individuals all have their own truths, or that, there is no true interpretation of literature or et cetera, because everyone can have their own interpretation of the truth. And Habermas, pretty geniusly discovers that this is a performance, that it's impossible for this statement to be true, because if this statement is true, right? Well, it can't be. So it's either false because you do believe the statement to be true, and if that statement that you believe to be true is that everyone has their own truth and there is no objective truth, then the statement is not objectively true by virtue of the argument that you're making. Or it is simply a performance. It is meaningless gobbledygook, like a court jester telling jokes that have no real meaning in their statements and argumentation. Right? Once we recognize that is true, that one cannot make an argument that is self-contradictory by their actions, by their beliefs, as opposed to, which is really to say, when we look at the P and not P, what we're adding is the not P is not necessarily the stated thing with the words they are saying, but the actions that they commit that prove that there's a statement that is being unsaid but is being performed, that is being acted out in the behavior. Once we arrive at that conclusion, we get to what is true argumentation. And true argumentation is two individuals conversing in some matter or another, two moral agents that have personhood, right? That we establish, most likely from a Bayesian inference. The species of human is one that has the rights of personhood, bodily autonomy. But even if you don't accept that, we'll stay on that for a moment, because I know, the Egoist will be like, pause, you haven't substantiated that. But what I would say is a moral agent, a moral actor, someone that is capable of making moral statements that are true or false, moral propositional claims, right? When you make moral propositional claims, in argumentation, which is to say you are speaking with another person and trying to either convince them of the truth of your claim, or convince them just convince them of the truthfulness of your claim, right? When you're engaged in that behavior, you are making a universalizable moral propositional claim along with that, which is that in order to do this, you recognize that I am an individual with my own thoughts. You can't actually force me to recognize the truth. You can beat me and torture me and attempt to brainwash me. But all of that violence is separate from the argumentation and separate from the moral propositional claim that you're engaging with your behavior, which is to say that you are saying that it is morally right to have a conversation free of coercion and violence to try and get me to arrive at your truth claim, because you believe via your actions that is the way in which we engage in making arguments. That an argument backed up only by the threat of force or violence isn't attempting to get me to realize the truth claim. It's getting me to submit to your will, and that violence is not what you're engaging in with your behavior with the form of argumentation. Once we recognize that, we recognize that when you argue for aggression, you're engaged in a performative contradiction, in that you are arguing that violence, coercion, theft, whatever it is that you're arguing for, be used against individuals that you simultaneously argue via the idea of argumentation, is a moral agent that has exclusive control over their own body, and that if you want them to recognize the truth value of claims, just like you're currently doing by saying we should tax, for example, that you need to not use aggression or coercion, because one cannot recognize that truth in that way. And then I think that then kind of sets up a foundation that leads towards, once you combine the theory of conflict and praxeology and AE, you get to an embordering first user privilege to property. Unfortunately, libertarians haven't quite figured out exactly where that property link is established. They cope and they use homesteading, mixing labor, but that's not the right answer. Embordering is closer. Historical use is accurate, but it's difficult to determine what makes a proper historical link to property. I have my own definition, but it's somewhat arbitrary, and other people will go, aha, there's the chink in your armor. There's where you're wrong. But it's just we merely haven't discovered it yet, and everyone else simply uses other arbitrary categories to avoid the discussion. Hopefully that was as good as I can do off the top of my head. I don't think that that's ready for a 5-year-old, but there you go. There's my basic overview.
As someone who's worked with many 5-year-olds, I think most 5-year-olds would understand every word of that.
Yeah,
but,
I tried. It's a difficult concept,
No, I can understand that. So immediately, my first thought, I'm going to avoid the part about subjective truths for now. I might come back to it later if we're interested. But I'm actually interested in the idea of subjective truth, as Scherner was. But I'm going to jump straight to the meat and potatoes of AE as a case against aggression. Because I think if the point of argumentation is always going to be to convince your opponent and not your interlocutor, and not make them submit to your will, so therefore aggression's off the table, I would also add there that defensive force is also off the table. Let's say that you've broken into my house and you say to me, Thoughtbat, I believe I should have a right to be in this house right now. And I'm saying, Scott, no, you have to get out. This is my house. Mm-hmm. You say, Thoughtbat, no, it's my house. There's going to be a point where I'm going to want, I believing I am the true property owner, I want to pick you up by the scruff of the neck and chuck you out the window. Right? Mm-hmm. I think argumentation, I can't, but at the same time, I'll be contradicting myself by arguing that I should do that. Because
No, you're stopped from arguing. You're stopped from arguing for your own rights until you pay for restitution and repayment.
So I don't argue for my own rights.
Well, you can't logically argue for your own rights because you're the one that's engaged in the performative contradiction. Me, because I'm the aggressor in the scenario, right? I'm the one breaking into your home. If I'm breaking into your home, I can no longer argue that you not, let's say, beat me up or eject me from your property or whatever I stole, you steal in return in some form of equal repayment. It gets weird because value is subjective, right? So we can get into really dangerous territory there without first coming to having some arbiter of determining how these arbiter determining how we resolve these issues. But that's not really a problem of the philosophy itself. That's really more of a pragmatic situation. But I'm stopped from arguing because I'm the one engaged in the performative contradiction. Because I'm saying, please don't beat me up. Please don't steal from me. Meanwhile, I have a ski mask and I'm in your house stealing your TV, right? So I'm the one engaged in the contradiction. You're not engaged in any form of contradiction by being the peaceful person that argues for universalizable human rights and then stopping the person that is stopping that. Because that person can't argue, because it's very individualist, right? Mm-hmm. Don't take it from you're taking it from the collective. I think maybe it might be the approach. It's not universalizable as a collective. It's universalizable collectively because it's a universal truth in terms of argumentation. But it's not universalizable it's not universalizable as a principle to each individual. Once the individual themselves engages in the contradiction, they themselves cannot argue that they have those rights. And me arguing for mine is not contradictory to me encroaching upon yours, right? The contradiction see what I'm saying?
In the hypothetical, both sides of a dispute believe that they are in the right, that they have the right to access the house for whatever reason, whatever rationale that they got in their minds. Now, let's say that ANCAP property theory would suggest that I am the just owner. But the other person doesn't know that. I might know that, but I might not use ANCAP ethics to justify it. I'm telling him to get out of my house.
Let me clean up your hypothetical. I think I have a stronger version of it that we can engage with and maybe elucidate. Let's say it's your house, right? You've been living in your house for 10 years, right? And I actually have documentation from 1910 that my ancestor handed down to me and willed to me. And he just died, right? He recently just died. And in the will, I open a trunk and stream hiccup. I don't know what to tell you guys. That might be a Rumble thing. So I open up the trunk that he handed to me and there's a deed to your house from 1905, right? And the house was actually stolen from me and I have all of the documentation. So actually, you're living in stolen property, right? And I come to reclaim my property that is rightfully mine, that I have the documentation proving is rightfully mine. But I come in the middle of the night with a ski mask. Maybe that helps better.
It's an interesting one. We still got a problem of we got two people who believe, for whatever reason, your reasons included, that they have a right to live in that house. They have a right to be in that house. Now, it would mean that neither of us can ever use physical violence to remove the other until the other is convinced. Well, not even until the other one's convinced. No one can use defensive force ever. Even if you take your documents to a verification agency who can say, right, this is all legitimate. You can't use force to move me out your house because you're not actually convincing me anymore. You're making me submit to what you believe the truth is.
But it's not about belief. There is an objective fact that exists, right? And this is why when you asked me to lay out the whole thing, this is why we have to talk about the beginning of conflict, right? When two people want to use the same property towards different ends, conflict has occurred. So we're in a conflict. We both want to use your house. There is an objective fact Sometimes it can be difficult as an observer to ascertain what that fact is, but it doesn't change the fact that there isn't a fact that someone established a historical link to that property. First, they had first user privilege, and they did not give up that privilege. They did not abandon that property. Now, we can get into the gray area when, as observers, because we're not God, right? We don't have perfect ability to always ascertain the facts as they are. But there is a fact that someone has first user privilege and the other person is an aggressor. Now, what you're saying is that both people, because they believe that they are not the aggressor, then the AE falls apart. And what I'm saying is, regardless of the individual's beliefs in the situation, one is factually the aggressor. And because they are factually the aggressor, they are stopped at the individual level from being able to argue that they're the ones that can maintain control of that property until they are no longer an aggressor. They have recanted their position and they have paid restitution and repayment. So in the example of your house, where you believe you're the legitimate property owner of your house, and I have documentation from the early 1900s that proves that I'm the legitimate property owner of the house and that you've actually purchased a stolen house. Well, that means that you are an accidental aggressor. You've accidentally aggressed because, and part of the restitution and repayment is the person that defrauded you when they sold you the property. You were a victim as well as an aggressor in this situation because you're trying to maintain control of stolen property and creating conflict. And it is necessary if we want a morally preferable society to reduce conflict, right? So it is necessary towards that, if that is your moral preference, that we resolve this conflict. And the way that we resolve this conflict is that you give me my house, and then you pursue whatever form of legal action is available to you towards the person that defrauded you in the sale of your home, which was stolen.
That's all well and good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fully on board with the idea that objective truth could exist, and neither party necessarily has the means of knowing what that truth is. Absolutely,
yeah,
that's all fair enough. You can say that there's a right answer in this. There's a right natural law answer, regardless of whether people know it. People didn't know what shape. People disagree on the shape of the Earth. It's still round. That's fine. But in terms of the performative contradiction, it suggests that you cannot submit your interlocutor into being convinced that you have the just right by force. Let's say you are the just owner of a house objectively, and you come with these deeds and you say, Thoughtbat, look, sorry man, these deeds prove that this is my house. And I look at the deeds and I sincerely don't believe that they're genuine. I'm like, no, you just fucking wrote them up on Microsoft Word yesterday.
Microsoft Copilot AI made a very convincing fake. Fuck off.
Exactly. I have that in my head. Now, do you respond with argumentation? Do you argue to try and convince me that that you are in the right, that your position is the true position, and whilst I argue that my position is the true position? Or are you allowed at any point to use physical force to make me submit to what you, at the end of the day, believe to be the truth? Because I'm still saying believe to be the truth because you acknowledged a few seconds ago that it's difficult. It can sometimes be difficult for any party to really know what the truth is. Because for all you know, it could have been fake. Yeah. Your great grandfather could have faked the deeds himself.
It also could be true that my grandfather gifted me fake documents, right? And you're actually the one that is right. That's not, and so this becomes a pragmatic solution of how you would attempt to institute rules and law in your society. But it doesn't change the objective fact that both of us believe, in this instance, we both believe that we're justified in using the property. One of us is right and one of us is wrong. The person who is wrong, right? The person who objectively doesn't own the property right, is stopped from arguing that they not be removed from the property, right? Now, we can engage with, when you said, what do you do? It's interesting because this is where libertarianism differs from a lot of other ethical systems, which is that we don't actually tell you what you ought to do. We only tell you a category of domains that we have proven that you ought not do, right? Or that you're not justified in arguing that you ought do, right? And so when you ask me that question, that's a personal question. That depends upon the current legal system in the area that you live in, and that depends upon my feelings, right? Maybe you're a giant asshole, and I'm like, I don't feel like dealing with you. Snap, snap, private security, get this man off my property. Maybe I'm really sympathetic to your cause and understand, dude, that sucks. Like, this is my property. Like, this guy's home is here. His belongings are here. His families are here. I mean, yeah, has he defaced my property? Yes, he defaced my property by drawing a line on the wall as his children got taller, right? That's a defacement of my property, but like, I feel for the guy. Like, this is his home, right? And so maybe I go, maybe you can get a loan from a bank. You know, like, I talk with you and I talk it out and I say, look, man, technically this is my property and I'm kind of in dire situation too. And I need the money from this property, but I plan on selling it. Let's, how about the two of us go to a bank and we're going to get a loan because someone defrauded you in the purchase of your home, and the bank will pay me because it's my property, the loan, and the loan will really be given to you to pay to me so that you can pursue legal action, because the two of us together should really work on getting this guy that sold you this stolen home so that we can get you your money back. And I'm willing to work with you and I'm willing to show up to court because I'm really sympathetic to your situation. So what you should do here is kind of irrelevant, right? What we're really talking about is, what do I have a right to do? And what I have a right to do is everything within the domain of the category of what I want to do with my property that does not aggress upon you, the aggressor in this situation, at least according to my opinion. But not just according to my opinion, because in this scenario, we're going to say supercomputer has determined, right, that I am indeed the rightful, legitimate owner of this property. And so what I have a right to do is follow the gentleness principle and say, hey, look, this is my home. I'd like you to leave. And then you say, I refuse. And then you say, look, if you refuse, I'm going to begin to pursue legal action. I'm going to bring in security. We're going to forcibly remove you from my property if I have to. And then again, how I go about that and what it is that I choose to do in that is totally kind of up to me at that point, because you don't have a right to argue against it. I don't understand this performative contradiction element that you're playing in, because it seems that you're playing off the opinions of the people involved and trying to set the objective fact to the side. But the objective fact and of who created the conflict is what's important here.
Well, the argumentation aspect is how two people seek to find the truth. So I can go with my document. You can come with your documentation and say, Thoughtbat, this documentation is correct. You're truth seeking. You're trying to establish what is the objective truth between two disagreeing parties. As soon as force comes in, regardless of whether either party thinks it's defensive or aggressive, becomes a performative contradiction, because we're no longer trying to convince the other person through argumentation that we are right and our position is true.
Again, I don't want to repeat myself, but the problem is that the logic is universal, right? But the ability for the individual to argue for their rights is individual. It is the individual that is the aggressor that is stopped from arguing for their rights. It's not a performative contradiction if I'm not violating anybody's rights, and I'm not violating their bodily autonomy, because they have contradicted themselves in the ability to be able to argue for their bodily autonomy. Now, let us change the analogy, which is we go through this whole process and the legal action comes in, and there actually is some form of proof that I'm the person that caused legal action against you, and I'm the person that had a forged document through no knowledge of my own. I become the aggressor. right? I now
No,
am the
you don't become
individual
the
that is I
You
did
were the-
become the aggressor.
No,
Well, I was the aggressor the whole time.
you were aggressive the whole time. You only become the aggressor.
We discover that I'm the aggressor. I apologize. We discover that I'm the aggressor, presumably, right? And so now, the entire time, I was the one that was actually stopped from arguing that any of the actions that I was doing throughout this process not be done to me and repayment and restitution occur.
And that's sort of, again, I don't really disagree with any of that. What I'm still saying, though, there's the performative contradiction in arguing in any instance that force can be used to defend your rights, because you're saying, right, here are the reasons why I should not reason with you. You're still saying that. If you're arguing why I should stop, yeah, of course you are. Because you're not using reason anymore to get you out of my house, to convince me to leave your house. You're using force.
Yeah, but I'm no longer in a contradiction when I make an argument, right? Argument A, person A, person B. Okay? Person A is arguing for taxation, right? They are arguing that aggression be used from other people. The performative contradiction comes from the fact that in this argumentation, in this argumentation, right? They are recognizing your bodily autonomy. They're recognizing all of these things. And what you're saying is, well, the performance becomes a problem when person B, for example, person A aggresses upon them. Let's say person A is the tax collector. And so the tax collector comes to pay taxes, and then I shoot the tax collector. And you're saying, well, person B is now also engaged in a performative contradiction because they're using aggression and violence as opposed to trying to reason with the tax collector that they should not collect taxes. And the problem with that, right, is that person A is in a performative contradiction via argumentation ethics because they are arguing for aggression against my bodily will. I am not aggressing upon someone's bodily will because I have been aggressed upon. And the reason that doesn't contain a performative contradiction is because I'm arguing that my bodily autonomy not be violated. You're violating my bodily autonomy. I'm defending the position that my bodily autonomy not be violated. Person A, the tax collector, is simultaneously arguing by engaging in argumentation that your bodily autonomy not be violated and arguing for the violation of your bodily autonomy. They're in a performative contradiction. What I am doing is saying my individual bodily autonomy ought not be violated. You're violating my bodily autonomy. Therefore, I'm defending that my bodily autonomy not be violated. There's no contradiction.
So, I'm not sure it follows. So you're saying that by me arguing with you, I'm necessarily suggesting not that I should use reason to convince you, but that I should respect your bodily autonomy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that
it's implied by my arguing.
Well, because you're recognizing that I have exclusive control over my body, and you're recognizing that I have exclusive control over my mind, and that by having exclusive control over my mind, you cannot actually force me to you can't coerce me into coming to the truth. Mm-hmm. Right? You have to use reason, maybe not reason, right? Maybe I'm dumb, right? Like, and you can use nothing but pathos and histrionics, right? But you're not violating my bodily autonomy, right? Like, so the reason thing is an additional unnecessary distinction, right? Like you can't coerce me, right? You can't force me into coming to your conclusions. You might be able to torture me into eventually submitting to your will, right? But that's not what you're doing when you're engaging in argumentation. You're and that's the distinction, is that you're choosing as a rational actor. Remember, we said and you said you agreed with the praxeological basic axioms from an egoist perspective, right? Which is you're a rational actor, you act in your own self-interest, and that all of your decisions are a choice in the world about what you value, right? And you agreed to all of those things. So when you're sitting down and arguing with me, you're presenting a moral preference for not torturing me, and instead for having a conversation and reaching the truth together. At the very beginning of this conversation, you stated that you wanted these conversations between the left and the kind of individualist libertarian right to be less antagonistic. You have a moral preference. You have a value for a small sense of cohesion in the anarchist movement, right? Even if it's tacit and temporary, building a little bit of that, because our real enemy is the state. So you have that moral preference, and you sit down without torturing me because you prefer that I reach the truth, and you recognize that I am an individual and you wish to use reason.
And that's all correct. That's perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so if I'm not allowed to use force to bring you to my conclusions, why is the property owner allowed to use force to bring the thief to his conclusions?
So you say you're not allowed, right?
Logically, it'll be a criminal action.
Right. So right, and that's because there's that contradiction. So when you say allowed, right, what you mean is that you're not justified in using force against me. Why am I justified? Why is my position justifiable and doesn't bump into a non-contradiction where you using force against me to try and get me into my argument isn't, right? Well, I think we just described why you using force isn't, and so we can move to the latter, which is why is it that I can shoot the thief in the night when they come onto my property? And again, I hate to reiterate the point, but if you came to my door and knocked on my door at 10 o'clock in the morning and you wanted to sell me Girl Scout cookies, I'm not allowed to shoot you. Well, why am I not allowed to shoot you in that instance when you, right? What I'm allowed to do at most, following the gentleness principle, is say, I would like you to leave my property. I don't want to buy any goddamn Girl Scout cookies, right? It's only when you refuse to leave that you become, and you aggress further. But you are the aggressor. But I mean, it obviously depends upon egress laws and like HOAs and what other voluntary shit you set up before, right? Presumably, if you're living in a neighborhood, they allow some base level of solicitation, or they don't. But nevertheless, not important. So when you come into the middle of the night and you aggress upon me, right? You violate my rights. So before this, let's say 6 hours before this, we were in a conversation at the pub, and we had a great conversation about, I don't know, the new Star Wars movie or whatever, right? Just a normal conversation. And when we made claims, moral claims, and about life and philosophy derived from Star Wars. And we were drinking into the night. And throughout this conversation, right, you were totally there. You were 100% there. You weren't an aggressor, and you weren't thinking anything nefarious. You had a few beers in you, and you started to glean information. And you realized that we were talking about lightsabers and blasters at one point, and you heard that I don't have a gun. And you were like, and for whatever reason that stuck in you. And you thought, man, this guy doesn't have a gun. He doesn't have any ability to protect himself. I know where he lives. He got way drunker than I did. So I'm betting he's passed out. He says he lives alone. I bet I could steal all his shit, right? And I could get away with it. So before that, we had a conversation. We made moral arguments. There was no problem. You violated a certain natural law by aggressing upon me, right? You engaged in the first contradiction, if you will. You haven't actually engaged in the contradiction as of yet, other than your previous statements in that regard. So you've contradicted your previous arguments with your actions. I wake up and I say, who are you? I still don't even recognize you from the bar, right? I go, who are you? What are you doing in my home? And you say, fuck you, I'm stealing your shit, right? Now, what you have demonstrated with your actions is that you're not deserving of human rights. You're incapable of deserving of your human rights until you recant your position of breaking into my home and you repay me all of the damages that you've caused. You're stopped from doing that because your actions prove more than your words did 6 hours ago at the bar. Your actions are proving that your true beliefs as the observer. I'm not a mind reader, but I can see how you act and engage in the world. Your behavior is contradictory to the Star Wars conversation we had at the pub. You have contradicted yourself, and you are no longer someone deserving of rights. This is the impasse. I say, what you say is, if you grab your gun and pull the trigger, you also are engaged in a performative contradiction, because you believe that one ought not aggress upon someone's bodily autonomy. I would say is their actions have proven that they are not deserving of their bodily autonomy. They have contradicted themselves, and they are not deserving of those rights. Now, if I go Billy the Kid hip fire shooting and a stray bullet hits my neighbor, I am guilty of the manslaughter of killing someone that was deserving of the rights to their bodily autonomy, because they are not the ones engaged in the performative contradiction. They are an innocent. But when I shoot just you are showing and proving with your actions that you don't deserve, or that you don't affirm that you have those rights. You're the one in the performative contradiction, not I, because it is not pertaining to actions that occur to me. It's pertaining to actions that occur to you. What am I justified in doing to you? And as you aggress upon my shit, I am capable of defending my shit, because you have proven that you're not arguing in favor of that
way. Yeah. There's still the disanalogy, though. I'm a disanalogy.
Okay. What am I missing?
So the essential part which you're missing here is that the aggressor, the objective aggressor in this instance, you being the thief, acknowledges that he is stealing. He even said it to the victim: "I'm stealing your shit." Yeah. However, in the analogy I keep going back to, both individuals believe that they have the right to the house, the same way a tax collector or a socialist or a state socialist believes that they have a right to tax you.
We've had Thoughtbat. Come on, man. We've already handled this. It's not about the beliefs of the individual. It's about the objective reality that one is the aggressor.
It's necessarily about the beliefs of the individual, because argumentation is the means by which we try and make the individual believe in the truth. Knowledge is true belief, justified true belief. Plato. But if we both disagree on whether or not I have the property right or you have the property right, neither of us can consistently use force against the other, because then we'd be dropping the idea of argumentation. We can't argue for our own uses of force, and we cannot therefore defend what may be rightfully ours.
Yeah, because
we can't.
There's no contradiction. There's no contradiction.
There is, because
can you explain the contradiction? What's the P? I hate to be the leftist here, right? That does this shit to me all the time. But what's the P and not P, right? Like, what's the P? The positive statement is I'm arguing in favor, right? Like, presumably the P is I'm arguing in favor of bodily autonomy as a universal principle, right? What's the not P?
The P is that in any dispute, you should engage in argumentation to resolve it and respect the bodily autonomy of the other. But a dispute implies a contradiction of belief as well, not just action, but of belief. So both parties believe that they are correct. Mm-hmm. And so as soon as you start doing what you believe to be retrieving your goods, I'm going to start doing what I believe to be retrieving my goods. Well, it seems neither of us are in contradiction, but by your standards, because
one of us is.
One of us is wrong to do so, but neither of us are contradicting ourselves. Because we're both asserting that we have a right, and that the other person is violating our rights to bodily autonomy and thus property.
I don't. It doesn't matter about whether or not you believe whether or not you're right. What matters is
because argumentation is about beliefs. It's not about Yeah, argumentation is necessarily about belief.
Okay.
I'm arguing with you now because we believe different things.
I'm gonna go a little bit into the Liquid Zulu domain, but I'm not gonna go to the extremes that he goes to. We're gonna talk about rape a little bit, but we're gonna do it in a way that actually makes sense. Mm-hmm. So let's say I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and there is a woman that I just hired as a secretary who is taking care of her elderly grandparent, right? Mm-hmm. And I say, I'll give you $200 if you suck my dick. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that interaction and the autonomy of the people? I'm just curious how you respond to this.
So the boss is offering money for sexual favors to a client, to a subordinate.
Right. So it's a perfectly voluntary interaction as far as you're concerned, right? It's just like prostitution.
Yes, it is prostitution. It's inappropriate for the workplace, mm-hmm. but it's prostitution nonetheless. It's a voluntary interaction.
So both people, despite the fact that we'll call CEO person A, we'll call young, destitute, attractive girl person B, right? Now, let's change it to suck my dick or I'll fire you. Just curious what your position is on this. Suck my dick or you're fired.
My true position on this is that I don't think the boss should have the right, the sole arbiter, should be the sole arbiter of whether or not she is fired.
Okay.
But if you apply to
so he should, right? So individuals don't have a right to determine whether or not someone works for them. Rights are not given to individual transactions no longer because you don't like the circumstances of it. Instead, we need to grab the guillotines and kill all the CEOs or forcibly remove them somehow and force upon all of the market co-ops so that the situation doesn't happen.
Well, that wasn't my argument. You asked me how
I don't know how you would pragmatically get. You said that the CEO doesn't have the right to fire his employees.
I don't think the CEO,
based upon his personal whims.
I don't think the CEO should be the sole owner of all the property, which is worked upon by the workers. But I don't see what this has to do with argumentation ethics so far.
Right. We're just playing a little bit of a game, right? And what I'm trying to get at, I guess we'll just kind of get into it because to be honest with you, I didn't expect you to bite the bullet on that. But again, you're actually an anarchist. What I'm getting at is that there is a certain level of power that you recognize that changes the dynamic of the relationship in person B versus person A, right? That like there's a bit of something there. And so there's a certain place where you morally intuit that this is a perfectly valid transaction. There's nothing wrong with it. Two individuals voluntarily choose to exchange commodity for a service. And then as we push the limits and how much of a power imbalance is, you start to feel an icky sense, right? That the transaction isn't as voluntary as you perceive, right? Uh-huh. That the power dynamic isn't. So what if the CEO is unaware of all of these other things and then later feels icky about what he did, right? Let's say the CEO just wants to have sex with this person and actually doesn't offer her money and doesn't threaten to fire her. He just sees a hot young girl in the office and wants to have consensual sex. Later, he learns she doesn't actually have very good marketable skills. She has no job. And she felt like she was in a position where it was either sleep with the boss or lose your job. And he feels really guilty about that at a later date. Well, how would you feel about the CEO in that situation?
It'd be different, wouldn't it? Because the reasons for Well, to be honest, I'd make the case that no manager should be sleeping with their subordinates whatsoever.
It might be a bad idea
those,
in general,
for
right?
for those reasons alone, like because it creates those power imbalances in that relationship. Because when you have that power imbalance between, I'm your sexual partner and I'm your boss, that distorts the relationship from being like a normal relationship where you're between two otherwise equals, and then you're literally
you like lord some power over me. There's almost an element of coercion here. But the boss didn't know that he was being coercive, right? The boss just got a hard on and saw a hot young girl in the office and was like, dude, let's get some. You know what I mean? Like, define the word it. You know what I mean? Like, Bill Clinton just wanted to get some cigar pussy, right? And then all of a sudden, he learns her situation, and he learns how he was kind of like accidentally coercive in the situation. To him, originally, it was just that he was just trying to have a consensual relationship with someone that he thought was an attractive person, and he didn't see anything wrong with it. He later gained information that proved to his own standards, to his own personal ethos, that at the time that he committed that act, he was actually coercing and doing something that he felt was morally wrong to that person. But he learns this at a later date, right? Mm-hmm. The facts of the case are what determines the aggression. It's not the individual's belief, because upon learning new information, the CEO feels differently about his own actions. Now this is a gray area. What I would say within AE and all this other stuff is in the domain of everything's justifiable, kind of. But like, we start to have moral intuitions about how we feel about the CEO as information changes. And he himself has different moral intuitions about how he feels about the acts he previously committed. Except those facts became revelatory to him and changed his opinion. But those facts were always the facts of the case. It was always true that she was destitute. It was always true that this was the only job she could get. It was always true that she needed the money for the cancer treatments for her grandma, right? And it was always true that we can add another element that he may not have known about, which is that she was sexually abused as a child and like has, a lot of anxiety and trauma and doesn't know how to appropriately respond to these situations. So what he thought was an entirely consensual sexual relationship becomes very akin to rape. We don't care that the CEO didn't know.
I agree that regardless of the beliefs of the subject in question, there may be an objective truth. I'm happy to conceding that to you. I'm happy to conceding that's the case. I'm happy conceding that in our house problem, there's an objective winner there, right? For the sake of discussing argumentation ethics, I don't think there is personally. But when it comes to two people, and I'm going to keep bringing it back to us, and you can hate me for it, but we seem to go around in circles. Mm-hmm. But in the case of two people in a dispute, a sincere dispute, it's not one where I just think you have no rights, and I'm not arguing with you anymore. If I don't believe you have the rights, I'm not arguing with you. I'm babbling to you. If I'm saying, look, Scott, this is I'm adamant this is my house, and you're saying, Thoughtbat, no, I'm adamant too that this is my house. This is my Scott's house. Then neither of us can use force against the other without contradicting ourselves, regardless of who is correct in that situation.
No.
Yes.
One of you is wrong.
There's no performance. One of us is wrong, correct.
Right.
But that has nothing to do with the performative contradiction. A performative contradiction is individual and subjective.
No. The performance that you're doing, let's say you're the wrong party. The performance that you're doing is that your actions are wrong. You may believe that they are right, but your actions in reality are an aggression, and therefore you are stopped. The other person is not, as the non-aggressor, is not in a performative contradiction because their actions are right. Now, both of you believe that you are right? Both of you wholeheartedly believe that you are right, and both of you may use some form of violence or nonviolence, however you may choose, right, to defend yourself or defend your position. Even legal action that is, costs the other party financial damages is a theft to their property, right? So unless you just do nothing and just sit there and allow the other person to roll over you, right, you're going to engage in some form of action that is violence. That violence may or may not be justified. You both bet. You both kind of place a bet based off of your beliefs and your evidence that you're the one that's not engaged in a performative contradiction. One of you is and one of you isn't, because we're not talking about your beliefs. We're talking about your actions. And your actions is that one of you is objectively an aggressor and you are acting that out. It is the unsaid part of the argument. That's why it's the same thing when we go to a performative contradiction that, as Habermas puts it, against the postmodernists, right? Because the postmodernists don't say that he's objecting to. They don't say, I believe this statement is an objective truth, and then period. And then the next statement is, there is no such thing as objective truth, period, right? What they say is, there is no such thing as objective truth. And then Habermas says, well, either this is a performance and it's a meaningless thing, or there's a contradiction here and the statement is false. It's right. Either it's intended to be comedy and meaningless and not an actual argument about reality or anything, or they do believe it, and their behavior by making the argument and putting it in a book and wanting other people to believe it is that they do believe that it is an objective truth, and this creates a contradiction. Right? It's the behavior of the aggressor that is maintaining their using violence to control property that isn't theirs, that puts them in the contradiction and the other person not in the contradiction, not their beliefs about whether or not the property is theirs.
The word contradiction, performative contradiction, implies that the positions you hold or the values that you hold are in contradiction with one another.
Or they're contraries, one or the other, yeah.
Or they're contraries. These are referring to things that I hold and I do. If actions reveal intention or preference or whatever, then we're still talking about attitudes and beliefs. We're not talking about our relationship with the truth. We're talking about our personal conduct. So when I say,
I get where you're going with this.
Yeah. If
I think I get what you're saying.
When I say, here's my reasons not to reason with you anymore, and now I'm going to throw you out the house because I think I am in the right, and you say the same thing, well, we're both performing that contradiction.
So what you're saying is, it's a performative contradiction to say, I ought to tax you and use the state to steal from you. But it's not a performative contradiction to say, I ought to keep my house. And because you believe the statement, I ought to keep my house, is the reality. So you're not actually, you're by then saying, right. So the statement you're saying is, I ought to keep my house, when in reality, it's not your house. But in your reality, in your world, it's your house that you believe that you ought to keep. And therefore, what you're saying is that you're not aggressing upon people. You're claiming the other person is actually the aggressor in this situation. And so the logic is consistent within your own beliefs. And so you're not engaged in a contradiction. That's your argument, I'm presuming?
Because the contradiction is always in reference to your beliefs.
Right. But what you're performing is you're performing that one ought to keep their own house, not necessarily performing that one ought to keep the specific house in question in reality, that is indeed not your house. That's the disconnect, I think, here, is that you believe that there isn't a contradiction because the person is stating that one ought, like universalizing, that one ought to be able to keep their own property, their own house, and they're not engaged in a contradiction. And I believe that what they're arguing is I ought to keep my house, and my house is a specific house that they are accidentally or they're unaware of is not their house. And that's the performative contradiction. It is a limit case, right? It is kind of a gray area. I'll give you that it does come off as confusing, but I would still argue that they are indeed arguing for aggression. They're simply doing so accidentally.
They're not arguing for aggression. They're arguing that their actions are not aggressive.
Yeah, but their actions in reality are aggressive, and they're defending their aggressive actions whilst arguing that aggression should not be done to individuals, which is the contradiction. Even though they think they're arguing in the right, they're making a wager, a bet. They're guessing that the property is actually theirs, or assuming as a kind of an axiom to their argument, a false axiom, right? The axiom to their argument, kind of, if you will, right? The foundation, it's not a moral axiom, right? But the foundation of their argument hinges upon a reality that is not, that doesn't exist. So it's a false argument. You see what I'm saying? So
yeah,
their argument is this house is my house. Part of what's baked into the argument is that the house actually is their house when it is not their house, and the argument is false. And then once the truth is revealed, they're arguing for aggression.
I see, I agree, and I understand. But, and this is a big but, argumentation ethics, the conclusion is that, that by arguing you're proving this X, Y, and Z. But now we're not discovering the truth of the contradiction.
I love when British people say Z.
Lol. When we say, we're not arguing that, I lost my thought there. It's
sorry, I'm ADHD as fuck. I don't know why. I just love when British people say Z or zebra. I don't know. It's cool.
Zebra. It's 11 p.m. here. So what I'm saying is, argumentation ethics proposes that it's the arguer, that by arguing, you're contradicting yourself by justifying aggression.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not, in this situation, we're not pointing to the fact that you're arguing to prove the contradiction. We're pointing to the fact of the matter with the historical relationship with the object.
But you are arguing for aggression. You're doing so accidentally, but you are indeed arguing for aggression.
And you can't prove that just by pointing out the fact that they're arguing. You can only prove that by pointing out the historical relationship between each person and the object.
Yes.
So you're not appealing to argumentation ethics anymore. You're appealing to history.
No, I'm appealing to argumentation ethics. The observer, right? The observer. No, listen. The observer, right, deals in a world of limited information where we attempt to ascertain the truth. The truth exists regardless of our ability to ascertain it. So the truth is that one person is indeed arguing in favor of aggression while simultaneously arguing that they not be aggressed upon and is engaged in a contradiction. And the other person isn't. They both believe that they are arguing logically and not engaged in a I almost said irregardless. I did. That they both believe that they are arguing logically and consistently, and that they're not engaged in a contradiction. The observer then attempts to ascertain the truth, and the observer makes an additional wager, right? So the rights enforcement agency, the covenant community's council of elders, whatever system you have that maintains order within whatever society you're living in, right? Makes a judgment based off of all of the available information to their best guess at the truth, right? But no one ever truly knows with 100% certainty. At best, we have this 99.9 repeating percent, right? We have the CCTV footage. Maybe it's a deep fake, right? Like we have the fingerprints at the scene. Maybe someone lifted my fingerprints, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? What we're doing is that the truth exists. And by nature of the truth exists, when one person is arguing to keep my house, they're not arguing about houses in general. That wouldn't be a performative contradiction, right? If they were arguing about houses in general, and they weren't attaching it to their specific house, there's no contradiction. You're correct. But once they engage in reality, once they say this house that is property, someone owns that house. And once someone owns that house, their argument, and whether or not their argument is contradictory, hinges upon the reality of the ownership of that house.
Yeah, it hinges upon the integrity of the argument hinges upon the reality of the ownership of that house. We're appealing to history.
Mm-hmm.
So when you said before, no, we're not appealing to history, we're appealing to argumentation ethics. It seems like you appeal to history.
Okay, I mean, like, I don't understand the distinction here, right? Like, argumentation ethics is what we're appealing to determine that it's a contradiction. We're appealing to history in terms because their argument itself hinges upon history. Like, but argumentation ethics is still the underlying thing when determining whether or not someone is stopped from arguing that they be removed from the property. So we're our actions are appealing to both, I guess you could say, and that's fine. But it's not appealing to argumentation ethics. So it seems like we're quibbling at this point.
I'm going to give a couple more lines, and then I'm going to go to bed because it's coming up 11:30. I'm very tired. I had a girl around last night. But
I see how it is. You're going to just try and throw that out.
It's actually not like that. We're very close.
Before you go though, I still want to hear a real reason as to why you denounce or maybe not denounce or renounce, but you refuse to accept anarcho-capitalism as the dominant and right philosophy. So far, all we've done is a tactical strategy about your beliefs in whether or not who is benefited based upon the philosophy that of people in the society. And I don't think that's a satisfactory answer to deny anarcho-capitalism, which is the right answer. I'm still curious about that. We've gone through AE a lot, and I feel like I've pretty soundly discussed it. I'll engage more, but I do want to hear that answer. I want to hear a real answer. What's wrong that keeps you away from it?
Sorry, you cut out for about 10 seconds there.
Jesus Christ, I must not been eating the mic.
I heard you up to ANCAP is right. Why?
Yeah,
why
I just want to, I don't feel like I've heard a satisfactory answer as to why you're not an ANCAP. All I've heard is a pragmatic answer about what is most influential based upon the philosophy that workers and bourgeois individuals hold. But I haven't heard like a real answer as to why anarcho-capitalism, with you then advocating for a covenant community that is socialist in some regard, is the wrong answer.
Oh yeah, I'll just clean up the argumentation ethics first before I go back to that.
Yeah, that's fine. That's why I just said before you go, I would love to hear it because I haven't heard anything.
We got to argumentation ethics because because we just sort of deviated from the explanation, but it still seems to me that for someone to be in contradiction with themselves, they need to be contradicting beliefs that they hold, and those beliefs are revealed through preferences. It's not going down for me the idea that we have to appeal to the objective truth of the matter. Yes, you're in contradiction with reality, but that's not a contradiction in the argument itself. It's more pointing to a false premise rather than a contradiction of sorts. Onto the ANCAP problem. As I've established, I'm an egoist, and thus I don't think rights are objective at all. I think we socially create rights, and to expect an anarcho-capitalist society to be viable, we need to also expect that natural law theory be applied reasonably consistently. I've given an example of an extreme situation where you admitted that you would negate natural law to save your son, and then I can think of another situation where we just add more people to the scenario, where people's values to negate natural law outweighs the value to maintain natural law. I can think of plenty of demographics which are incentivized to expropriate CEOs and absentee owners and run the company themselves democratically, pay each other's, determine their own wages, keep the product of their own labor, so to speak. So those, I think, a good many people would have.
So let's go with all three of those. Let's go with all three of those, right? So number one,
and the last point, I'll just finish up. The whole point is, I don't think it's feasible to expect an anarcho-capitalist society to exist. Economically speaking.
Okay.
For the reasons I gave.
Okay, so number 3 and 4 kind of go together. So I'll tackle that. Number 1 was the rope scenario. Because an individual commits a crime against another person's or property, but because their intuition to survive may cause them to commit a crime, you believe this invalidates anarcho-capitalism. I don't understand how.
Your actions. Well, you admitted right there that you and any reasonable person would negate the natural law conclusion. You would contradict natural law there.
Yeah, I mean, like when someone says, save a penny, steal a penny to save the world, right? People will constantly cope and say they won't steal a penny to save the world. But that I made no moral claim that one should save a penny to save the world. What I made was a claim that all people likely would steal a penny to save the world, right?
So you're saying that in that situation, natural law is unviable, as in it will not be materialized or realized.
I'm not saying it's unviable. What do you mean by unviable? I'm saying most people would violate.
You have no economic reason to expect it to be applied.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect in extreme circumstances like that a majority of people would refuse to steal a penny to save the world.
So you say extreme.
However, if
I'm going to throw the question. Hang on, let me just come in. I'm going to throw the question at you then that Liquid Zulu threw at me. Where we setting the mark on extreme here? Where's a threshold from it to go from a general situation to an extreme situation?
Okay. Yeah. No. So in the best. See, the problem is that. Yeah. No. Like it's a subjective line, right? So like once you say steal a penny to save a world, and you say that one should or one ought do so, you then bring yourself into a position where where you draw the line on should and should not becomes an internal subjective analysis, right? And thus you end up justifying all evils. I don't justify stealing a penny to save the world. In fact, what I would say is that in a world where everyone behaved as an anarcho-capitalist, right? And no one engaged in behavior that violated the personal autonomy of other individuals, either on purpose or not on purpose, but let's just say on purpose, right? You couldn't be in that scenario, right? Because it would be like you couldn't be in that situation. The only reason that that situation would exist is almost certainly because we don't live in that world. So because we live in a world where people, I don't know though, because the rope and the quicksand one, presumably some cheeky piece of shit could intentionally put rope near quicksand. Though of course I would just tell my kid to lay down on his back and then I would just grab him. Or he could crawl. Like it's not really that difficult. You don't need a rope in the quicksand. But like I understand the intent of the analysis. Right? Like you could just easily make it a cliff, or something, right? Like you make it something where a rope would be more helpful. But yeah, so I mean, maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe I'm wrong on that analysis. Maybe that still could occur in a perfect world where everyone followed the NAP. Even still, I don't feel like I need to bite the bullet on something that I didn't claim, which is that you should. What I bit the bullet on was that most people would, right? And so most
in that
is
situation,
the key
natural law is
distinctor here, because what you're doing is you're making a rational decision as an individual, right? You're doing a cost benefit analysis in your head when you make that decision based upon your own rational self-interest. You're saying, I'm going to be branded a criminal. I'm going to have to pay restitution and repayment. And whatever my rights enforcement agency will recognize that I'm at fault here, and they'll pay this guy the $20 and my son will be alive. Right? And no one will likely morally shun me within society because most people will understand why you committed that crime. Right? Like I wouldn't, like, you know, like when someone's a heroin addict and they rob a store, but they don't hurt anybody. Right? And they've been clean and sober for 10 years. There's a small cohort of conservatives that would be like, once a druggie, always a druggie. Don't trust them. Right? And then, but the majority of the population will look at you and be like, holy fuck, man, you've been clean and sober for 10 years. You went through some dark times. I bet you learned a lot, and you probably have an empathy, and you're probably a better like you've been through so much. I bet you have wisdom, right? Or there might be some morally neutral kind of area too, where people are like, I don't care what you did 10 years ago. You're clearly not that person anymore, right? So all these people fall within this different domain. So when I'm doing this cost benefit analysis of what I'm going to do, I'm looking at two anti-life positions, right? The death of my son or the theft of property. I simply can't make the moral claim that one ought to steal in this situation. Because it would be contradictory.
That's
right?
fine. You don't have to. All I need from you there, all I need for me to carry on with my answer is that in that situation, you'd understand that it'd be economically unviable to expect natural law to be realized there. And all I do is I add bodies.
Reality is going to be different, right? Reality is going to be different from theory in certain regards. Like human beings we're not perfect in like we like there's logos, pathos, ethos, right? You know what I mean? Like we're not all autistic people, right? Like sometimes we do dumb shit, sometimes we do criminal shit, sometimes we do bad shit. I would argue that it's you're kind of forced to choose between two bad things, and you chose what you thought was the lesser of two bad things, but you're still a criminal. It doesn't matter. I don't understand why what that invalidates or stops you from recognizing.
Well, it seems to me that you've acknowledged that you would negate the law in that situation, and so would any other reasonable person. So it seems that the enforcers of law, which ends up being reasonable people,
any other reasonable person, right? But fair enough.
The vast majority of reasonable people, to a point, it has any kind of influence on any legal system within a given community. Natural law would not be applied in that situation. Whereas situations where natural law,
yes, it would. Yes, it would.
No. Why would the legal institution? What do you mean?
The legal institution would force you to pay the $20. Your insurance rates probably wouldn't even go up. You wouldn't even feel a notice in your bank account, but the legal institution would still recognize the right of the property owner to have exclusive control over their property, and would deal with the criminal act of stealing the rope as necessary, which would be very limited. And then most other people like you, would be like, that guy's a weird asshole and I don't do business with him. And then, the market would put pressure on this individual to stop engaging in behavior where they intentionally put rope near quicksand, hoping people fall into it and are forced into this weird pseudo moral dilemma, right? You know what I mean? Like, no, the legal institution is perfectly valid and holds in that scenario.
It seems that no, not quite, because there's no. If law is there to determine who is the winner of a dispute, okay. In that situation, the owner has lost that dispute because he said that he doesn't. Well, he wrote a great big sign, if you remember, saying, "I don't want anyone to use this rope." By using that rope, he's lost the dispute. We can't determine the value of the rope to him, or what the sentimental value of that rope staying in that one place was to the owner. All we know there is that the owner lost the dispute and he's being compensated to some degree. What's happened is the criminal has got his way, and he's made a cost-benefit analysis saying, well, actually, I'm happy paying $20 for this because this is how the rights enforcement agency would likely deal with it. The aggressor here has won that dispute.
How has the aggressor won the dispute? I don't understand.
He's had his means be actualized, and the aggressor and the victim has not.
Right. But so no, right? Because whatever the value is of the rope, let's say the rope's value, subjective value to to the property owner is $1 million, right? So the guy who owns the rope, he values the rope at $1 million. Highly unlikely, but let's say he does, right? In this instance, he goes to a rights enforcement agency and wants insurance on his home and his rope. And the rights enforcement agency is going to say, hey, the rope's worth $20. And he's going to go, no. It's worth $100 million. And the rights enforcement agency is going to go, well, I'm not going to protect your fucking rights because that's insane, right? And so the likely scenario is that the subjective value is
not
given a value of $20, right? Voluntarily by the person who owns the rope. Now, let's assume that they don't own, let's say they have no rights enforcement agency. They have no, and they don't live in a covenant community. They don't live in any type of system that has any laws that they voluntarily agree to, right? So they don't live in a covenant community. They don't live in your society. They don't live in my society, right? I'm trespassing on their property, right? Presumably, because, you know, they have this rope, or, you know, they put the rope in some form of common property or something. So maybe I'm not trespassing on their property initially, right? So I'm trying to be as charitable as possible. So it's on common property. And he happened to put the rope in that little area. So just that little area is his property, right? So this person has no voluntary agreements, and so they're demanding a value of $100 million. The problem is the same problem that we had before, right? Which is the reality is different than the stated goal. The reality is that there actually is a value that person has towards that rope. And it's highly unlikely that it's $100 million, right? That is to say, the value is how much in that exact moment, labor or resources are they willing to expend to lose that rope, right? And that changes from moment to moment, from time to time. The value of the rope could change to $20 and it could go to $100 million. It's possible, again, unlikely, but value changes over time. Right. And it is subjective and internal. So when you say that the property owner lost because the other person was able to use his rope, well, he only lost if he's not compensated for the value, his own value to the rope, which is a fact, but it's a fact that is impossible to determine as an observer. We can't actually determine the real value of the rope. And the value of the rope changes from instant to instant, right? Like in one moment, the rope may be worth something. And then in another day, like you said, you had a girl over last night, right? Right? The value of certain products can change based off of your mood. So yesterday, you might be willing to let go of your own property cheaper because you're in a better mood because, you know, you had a girl over. And today, you're getting sleepy, you're getting tired, you're getting a little angry. I don't know, right? You don't have a girl over tonight. And so the value of the rope is more to you because you're stingy right now because of your behavior. So the property only lost if he's not compensated for restitution and repayment. If he is adequately compensated for restitution and repayment, then we've returned the conflict status back to its natural state. No one has lost. No one has won.
Well, how could we possibly say that he hasn't lost when we're basing it on compensation for value, and value is something that we can't. The true value is the true value. The subjectively true value, maybe, is not something that we can verify in any shape or form. It seems that we can't verify if he has actually lost or not. It seems to me that the better metric to determine whether he's lost or not is to have the desired actions be carried out or not. So if the desired action was that the rope not be used, and then the other person didn't use the rope, that's him winning out in that conflict. Or if someone intervened and stopped him from using the rope.
Right. So you're saying he lost the initial conflict and then the conflict was resolved.
Well, we don't know if the conflict was resolved. The conflict was resolved as soon as the property owner put the rope back down. A new conflict erected when he's suing for damages. There's two conflicts there. One is don't use my fucking rope. Two is you owe me compensation for this now.
Well, I mean,
he lost the first conflict.
Presumably, I would be stopped from arguing that I not pay restitution and repayment. So I don't know that I would necessarily categorize that as conflict. I guess you could, because the property in question would be, whatever commodity I'm holding on to that is of equal value to the rope. And then I lost that conflict and into such a way to return the status to a point where we both could argue for individual rights again.
And let's say the rope wasn't damaged at all. Like it's just a very good rope, and you pull your son out, and then you toss it to the side, and then he's seen you use his rope. The rope's not damaged. What leverage would he have to even demand compensation there? No repair.
He could demand repayment potentially. Depends on the legal system. How it depends pragmatically on the system that's set up, right? Because recognizing that, right? Like legal system in the sense of not natural law, but like from a pragmatic perspective, because there is a disconnect between reality and our ability to ascertain reality and our ability to establish and maintain order in accordance with that reality, right? So there's going to be, right? So there's going to be systems that set up that attempt to their best to get to reality. Sometimes those systems will be wrong, and sometimes those systems will have conventions that other people voluntarily agree to that aren't necessarily a part of natural law. They're only a part of natural law in the sense that they voluntarily agreed that they be under those rules and regulations, right? So like if you want to live in a socialist society, for example, then that's not necessarily like natural law, the legal things that you put in that society. It's a different form of law that is voluntary that you've set up. So there's a lot of little tricky bits in how we deal with repayment. But at a base level, the rope is returned to its natural state. And if it's returned to its natural state and it's like a perfect rope, right? And the rope received zero damage, and the property owner's, let's say, completely unaware that the rope was ever used, then the criminality is resolved. Right? Now, the property owner gets to argue at a minimum that he used my rope in the same way that does his zero damage to the rope for the same period of time, or that he be compensated in some regard of something of equal value towards that retribution. But like, he can't come smack me or beat me or anything like that. He just gets to come and tug on my rope. I might enjoy that, actually.
You could say the rope has lost sentimental value because he doesn't want other people touching that rope. It's icky to him. So it's damaged in that kind of way.
He could. How do we determine that, though?
Well, we can't. Which is why I say
exactly.
The standard for whether or not he's won or lost a conflict should be on whether or not his desired actions took place or not. I think that's the easier way to determine that. But I don't
know that I necessarily disagree with you. Right? I don't know that I necessarily disagree with you, but I think that there's an element of restoring, right? That is a part of I would say is still a part of the initial conflict, right? And so the conflict is resolved. Like did he lose the initial conflict by someone else using his rope? Yeah, I feel like I tend to agree with that, right? That just makes sense. What I'm simply saying is that restitution and repayment, or retribution, it depends on who you're talking to. Restitution and retribution, right? Like is a necessary element to the resolution of the conflict. And then the resolution of the conflict at the end, assuming retribution and restitution is paid, is a return to a morally neutral position, right? Everyone is back at square one because, and if not, then retribution and restitution has not been adequately paid, or it was overpaid, right?
Mm-hmm. And we're stuck with that continuum problem that can only be solved by positivist legal systems, which you don't seem to be against, to be honest, which is fair enough.
No, it's like I recognize that like there's that the observer is inadequate at determining reality, right? Because we're not omniscient, right? Or omnipotent. Sorry, you know what I mean? Like we're not all knowing, and so we're gonna get shit wrong, and so that means that we're gonna have kind of voluntary, like someone that refuses a rights enforcement agency, refuses to live in a covenant community, refuses to live in a commune, is an inherent threat to everybody else because of that problem, because of the inability of the observer, right? Like there's something wrong with that person that refuses to engage with society based upon like kind of voluntary rules. And so they should be treated with a certain mistrust because the subjectivity of it complicates our ability to engage meaningfully with this person, right? And so that's kind of how I view that situation. Is they either already have agreed to a voluntary set of systems that allows us to meaningfully and easily resolve these conflicts, or they refuse to do so. And the question becomes, why do you refuse to do so? And we should really be wary of you because we put ourselves in all of these problematic situations because you refuse to agree to a certain common law set of standards that we can all live with because we kind of need them to function easily.
Mm. I agree with that. Sovereign systems can pose a certain threat. And on top of that, there could even be groupings of pedo gangs who say, right, okay, well, here's our legal system. Our legal system says pedophilia is legal now. And how would our polycentric legal system deal with that? Now, that's the topic of my next video, actually, which is going to be a big, long video essay, like my first video on anarchist law. My first video was called An Introduction to Anarchist Law. My next one's going to be called An Elaboration on Anarchist Law, where we deal with those problems specifically. I think you might be interested in it. But on that note, I think we generally agree on that final part. I'm going to call it a night because it's 1:45.
All right. Well,
I've enjoyed talking to you. I've enjoyed talking to you.
I mean,
I hope you enjoyed talking to me. I'm afraid I'm quite boring because I don't scream at people, but
no, I mean, you can be boring. We're on Rumble.
There we go.
If we were on Twitch, I'd be like, all right, let's fucking move it on. We got to get the show rolling, you know? When you're on Rumble, I have a little bit more freedom because it's like, if it does well, it does well. If not, I just want to have a good conversation.
I'll be honest, mate, I've not even heard of Rumble until tonight.
You've never heard of Rumble?
I've never heard of Rumble.
Okay. So I do have one question from chat before we dip out, right? Because there's this idea of only that you presented, which is we do have near perfect, and Casimir, one of my people, is asking, we have near perfect knowledge in certain situations, right? You would acknowledge, for example, that taxation is wrong, right?
Not objectively. I'm opposed to taxation, but I don't say it's objectively wrong.
So what about it? What about it is lacking the idea that it is objectively wrong to steal from people and use force and coercion to do so?
The lack of any objective moral code, which I find convincing. I'm opposed to taxation because it's non-consensual against me. I don't consent to it, so therefore I'm necessarily opposed to it. Same with rape.
Final question, not from chat. You know, we went through argumentation ethics. We went through, a lot of things. It seems like you kind of agreed to the praxeological positions. It seems that you agreed to logic in and of itself. It seems that you agreed to performative non-contradictions. You have this sticking point on that I don't quite understand when it comes to I ought to keep my house versus I ought to keep this house. And because your argument hinges upon reality, it's no longer a performative contradiction. I don't understand that, but it feels like you're so fucking close to an objective morality. Like, what is it going to take to get you over that hump, that 0.01% hump that keeps you from being an ANCAP?
It's interesting. Well, first, there's multiple routes. First off, I'll need to be convinced by that kind of object of natural law theory and its validity to be applied in all cases. And if I'm not convinced that way, then I'll have to be convinced economically to say that anarcho-capitalism is a viable system that can compete alongside my preferred systems.
Well, I don't think you have a preferred system that violates anarcho-capitalism. Like anarcho-capitalism says that you're. Are you saying that? What's that?
There's a semantic problem for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you want to live in a covenant community that goes by your rules and your regulations, you're perfectly free to do so. So I don't understand the economic argument. If it's just an economic argument away from an argumentation ethics argument, you're already a fucking ANCAP.
By a certain definition.
You just prefer to live in a mutualist society, right?
By a certain definition, that's perfectly acceptable. I went in my video on anarcho-capitalism, which is talking about the definitions of the word capitalism. There's some definitions which I fit into, and I acknowledge this in the video. It was capitalism 1, definition 1, which is often given by libertarians and ANCAPs, which is a system of free and voluntary exchange with respect for property rights. Well, I fit in that. It's only that my preferred system is so different to what a lot of people, including ANCAP, my system is different to the system envisioned by people when they talk about capitalism. And when people talk about capitalism, they think of like... Well,
remember the very beginning, and I know you got to go, and I'm holding you, and I'm sorry, but I'll be very quick. Remember in the very beginning where we talked about the weak anarchist, and I described someone that like did mutual aid, did all the things, had all the theories, was quoting Kropotkin, but then they argued that the state should take over healthcare. And you said that this was a baby anarchist or someone that had come from socialism. This was contradictory to individual rights to give the state a monopolistic power as a means of fighting the insurance company. I would say the same thing about ANCAPs that say that you don't get to live in your socialist commune, right? Or that you don't get to live in your mutualist area. So long as you're allowing me to live in, ANCAPistan or a religious covenant community or whatever it is that I prefer. And so long as you have like property lines, right? Like an area that you designate your community, and you don't interact with other people's community except with trade. You don't like just be like, well, I actually own the trees because nobody owns the trees. And you just like come into like our community and start cutting down our shit and taking it. As long as you're there, you're not in contradiction. I think there are a lot of ANCAPs out there that are obsessed with right-wing libertarianism. And so because they believe that socialism economically is not efficacious, that it is not anarchist to live in your commune, I would make the same argument to my side that they're full of shit.
Yeah, I can't see myself arguing to raise an army to go and invade a different territory just because they've got a different economic system. Again, it's very egoistic to focus on what is our own communities. So I think that's fair enough.
Fair enough. This is why I like talking to mutualists and egoists. It was anybody that doesn't. You're still a psychopath.
A psychopath is someone who doesn't draw value from social interaction. And yesterday I had one of the best nights of my life. The best evenings of my life. But again, we're just friends. We didn't do anything.
I'm just messing with you.
Nah, she's a special girl. But anyways, I'm gonna say good night and enjoy the rest
sleep.
of your enjoy the rest of your show.
Yeah, of course.
Ta-da.
All right, you have a good one.